Environmental peace building is a strategy or set of strategies or approaches to try to turn, in some ways, the focus on environment and conflict or climate change and conflict on its head and ask a different set of questions, one that suggests that, perhaps there are ways to take advantage of the interdependencies around environmental issues, shared water, shared forests, shared resources, shared climate for sure, atmosphere in terms of um, those kind of crossing borders, whether those are national or subnational, international, and looking to proactively find ways to manage those resources, manage the environment, address the climate change in ways that try to build trust and ultimately build peace based on the need to cooperate, based on those interdependencies. And so this is about 25 years or so where it has been a specific area of study where the terms environmental peacemaking, environmental peace building have tried to organize what is still a young and growing field. Um, those of us who were working on it in the late 90s, early 2000s really were responding to the overwhelming focus on the conflict dimension and finding that while really important, it was a relatively limited discussion and there was a lot more to it. And so it has led to what is, as I said, a growing area, still a diverse set of possibilities, issues, scales, geographies. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like and the prospects for still trying to figure out what works, what doesn't, what works better, and what doesn't. So an emerging field, but one that does now have a couple decades of work behind it. And so in some ways, we have focused certainly on the environment conflict, climate conflict, on how environmental natural resources are central to a dispute. And so the kind of high stakes, high priority. But part of what the environmental peace building approach also allows for is the opportunity to talk, build patterns of cooperation, build trust, hopefully contribute to peace around environmental issues where it is a low priority, right? It may not be the source of the tension between two parties, whether those are local communities or countries or regions. And so it's important to be open to and have an inclusive view of what role the environment may be playing. It may be safe space because it's not really contentious and can build a foundation of cooperation and trust, or it could be absolutely central to the conflict and still need to try to find ways to take advantage of the interdependencies to build trust and patterns of cooperation. So this is a figure that has been developed over time by Carl Brook from the Environmental Law Institute and the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. Carl and colleagues have really thought about what role environment plays along what is commonly referred to as a conflict continuum. So the pre-conflict or conflict prevention on the front end, going up into conflict, the kind of the orange in the middle. And so how can environment be part of getting out of conflict, conflict termination, often called peacemaking? And then in the post-conflict period, where there are obviously really big priorities of getting the economy started and finding employment for ex-combatants and returning to stability so that semblance of life can come back in the kind of most violent forms of it, certainly analogous in less conflictual but still tense situations, where environment is often dismissed as a luxury item, a second tier issue, what you worry about later, when in fact, the ability to start farming again safely, to drink the water, to generate income and livelihoods from natural resources is absolutely central to rebuilding back a stable context. And so there are lots of different ways then along this continuum and over time that environment is part of conflict continuum, but also the peace building dynamic set of dynamics along that continuum as well. It is really important to remember that while kind of pre-conflict, conflict, post-conflict feels like a line and a progression, that one of the very largest and best explainers of how parties fall into conflict is whether they've had a conflict previously. So in many ways, you're doing conflict prevention in a post-conflict setting. So it is a circle. So you're kind of doing post-conflict and conflict prevention at the same time. So I like to think of it in this kind of circular fashion as well. And so environmental peace building has a definition or a few definitions. This is one of the more recent ones, one of the ones that the Environmental Peace Building Association is using. A number of us authored an article that was the lead article on a special issue on environmental peace building in the journal International Affairs. And in that article, we have not very eloquent or elegant, but still trying to capture the notion that it's a framework that has multiple approaches, multiple pathways, where environmental management is integrated in and can support conflict prevention, mitigation, resolution, recovery. So following along that continuum. So a lot of flexibility in that, a lot of different manifestations then, and still in the process of trying to understand what works and what doesn't in some ways the universe of ways. And the climate and peace and conflict dimensions are ones that are still almost by definition emerging, because our responses to climate, I would say, are still emerging. So continues to be an area of growth and lots of new and exciting work. So I want to use the water example in part because it was where the early work focused, where today's work really has a great deal of attention. And it's one where, in some ways, because of rising demand, um, declining availability, there's a lot of kind of intuitive sense that this will be an area and an arena for current and growing conflict around water. And this figure, produced interestingly as part of National Intelligence Council analysis, so kind of whole of government security and intelligence understanding, where the assessments have been done of both climate change and water and security, but really gives a sense that in the present, we have large swaths of the world that are under extremely high water stress. And at the same time, I often kind of put this number out and ask folks to think of what it might be a number for. And in the water space, there are at least 283, and the number continues to grow, of countries, or of river basins that are shared by two or more countries, either as a border or between one and the other. And so it's meant to say that the world is a highly interdependent space around water. There are lots of shared international river basins. And this map gives you a sense that they are, again, with perhaps the exception of Australia, kind of truly interdependent in all parts of the world, right? So upon thinking, it's like, well, we have increasing stress, increasing demand, highly interdependent. Isn't that going to be a real basis for conflict between countries? And so why are you talking about these prospects for conflict with an environmental peace building presentation? And certainly the journalists have lots of attention to and screaming headlines about coming water wars, or even ones that are present because of these stresses. The politicians make some pretty bold statements. This happens to be three Egyptians, and we'll see in part why Egypt is particularly concerned about water and conflict, but also willing to have this kind of inflammatory predictions to suggest that war is inevitable around water. And the Nile basin, where Egypt is the downstream, kind of dependent on everybody else upstream country for a huge percentage of its GDP and household use. Kind of every imaginable use of water in Egypt is highly dependent on the Nile. The upper riparians include Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, most importantly, Ethiopia, where the largest percentage of water comes from in the Nile. And so this is often framed as where water wars are going to happen because of that high level of Egyptian dependence, a large military, and a willingness to kind of make threats and make warnings about conflict. At the same time, starting in particularly the late 90s, facilitated by the UN, but also the World Bank, you had high level, all countries, ministerial level negotiations, often quiet and not as public, in part to be able to talk through how do we move from colonial era Nile Basin agreements that really favor Egypt to saying it's not just about water rights to a certain amount, to what are the needs, all the kind of mapping all the different ways that water is used and pulling off the political boundaries and talking about sharing benefits and finding ways to cooperate because it was such an essential resource for all the riparians. This has been tested for sure. This is the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Ethiopia has tremendous energy deficits for a very large population. And so the asset that they have, which is significant water, is one that they are now building large infrastructure to capture, which has created, again, tensions with Egypt. Yet, for a variety of reasons, including around the nature of water itself as a resource, going to war has not been an efficient fashion to solve these problems. And it remains, again, an issue that has lots of saber rattling, as we say, lots of heated political rhetoric, but not actually leading to conflict in kind of a violent and kind of use of force manifestation. Now, one case is not kind of enough evidence base, right? So we step back, and these are data that are the last half of the 20th century, done by Aaron Wolf, a geographer, and his graduate students at Oregon State University, where they took every interaction that they could find between countries around water and coded them from most conflictual to most cooperative. So most conflictual, formal war, most cooperative, formally signing an international water treaty. And as these data show, there's a lot in the middle, right? There's a lot of verbal support, so kind of easy commitment to cooperation, but significant number of basin-wide treaties, or at least bilateral treaties. There's a lot of verbal hostility. There's a lot of that saber rattling, but no times where water was the formal cause of war. The military acts, I believe it's 27 of the 37 are Arab-Israeli. So one region, one kind of ongoing conflict explains most of the majority of the conflict around water in terms of more formal violence. And so those are still concerning, and as we know today, continue to be a great concern. Yet this is a different story than the kind of inevitability of water wars, and gave us then a basis to say, okay, so it doesn't just happen, but if you really do put in the diplomatic work to fashion cooperation, including formal mechanisms like treaties, these are ways that, because of the importance of water, we can find ways to share those benefits and actually have this be a force for cooperation and peace, even in potentially tense situations. This is a figure that may be interesting to dive into, has kind of the distribution of what were the types of events under cooperative and conflictual. And the kind of short story is that there's lots of different types of cooperation. On the conflict side, it's overwhelmingly arguing about quantity. And so this is often when, even when agreements exist, it's a right to a certain amount of water in an allocation. Well, unfortunately, water, rainfall, precipitation, runoff change over time. And so sometimes those more inflexible mechanisms become more difficult. And so a focus on quantity is where a lot of the conflict that we do see occurs. And I will say this is one area, it's easy to be cynical about international law, but this is one area where a 1997 treaty with the inelegant title of the UN Convention on Non-Navigational Use of International Watercourses came into force about 10 years ago and has some core principles that are trying to kind of lock in the dimensions of interactions that encourage cooperation and help avoid conflict. So if one party is to build significant infrastructure, it requires prior notification of affected parties, and that there's an obligation with new infrastructure, think a dam, that it's not going to cause significant harm for downstream and other parties in the basin. Now, of course, there could be a lot of debate about what no significant harm is, but it provides a process and a set of obligations that that the countries have signed up for, and gives avenues for dialogue, technical management, interactions that can be supportive of peace. So this water case is one that they're kind of really encouraging signs. Here in the United States and to our north, Canada, obviously the Great Lakes are a huge resource, economic, ecological, cultural, recreational, and political. So it is not that there aren't real differences over time or tensions between the two countries or between provinces and states. Yet the International Joint Commission is the kind of technical transboundary organization that is designed to study the issues together and kind of generate that science and that analysis together as a way to build trust, and then find ways to have kind of establish mechanisms to navigate and negotiate the sharing of these tremendous water resources. And so it is not always working as well as the IJC is, right? If we look to the south between US and Mexico on the Colorado River, an old treaty that in a very wet year gave the United States rights to water that is between declining rainfall and in particularly increased use and drawdowns mean that sometimes that river hardly makes it to Mexico, and what's there is often quite polluted. And so that's an example of inflexible mechanisms that are continue to be a big source of conflict and contestation between the two countries and among the states on both sides of the border. In this way, it is sometimes, whether it's fair or not, I think even in some of the most contested areas, some of this cooperation is going on. And some would say, oh, well, this good water neighbors between Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis, a cooperation around water, although the quality of water, right? It's kind of premised on the notion that everybody's kids get sick if the water's not treated, the wastewater. And so the lack of sanitation is a shared vulnerability that cooperation helps address. And so some would say, well, that's not going to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Well, of course it's not. But it is an avenue at a very local level to do some basic interventions, right? Water, sanitation, and hygiene interventions done at the school level in communities that are paired, kind of geographically interdependent around water issues or the poor quality of water issues, and building that with peers in the different communities, part of a non-governmental organization called EcoPeace, used to be called Friends of the Earth Middle East, that has Jordanian, Palestinian, Israeli co-directors, and just saw one of those co-directors, actually all three co-directors recently at Environmental Peacebuilding Conference in light of the war in Gaza, talked about how stressful and how strained the operations are, yet they continue to operate with the premise that it's essential to cooperate on these shared ecological challenges, and have a lifeline for dialogue when the conflict is at its worst. The picnic table talks were examples where it was an example, historical example, where Israeli and Jordanian hydrologists would meet at a picnic table to jointly manage the Jordan River, building trust that ultimately was a significant contributor to the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel. So even in these toughest of times, it's not going to solve the problem, but provides this avenue for dialogue. Other tough times, uncertain relationships, certainly US and China, that has been the case. It has ebbed and flowed over time, but the kind of cooperation and collaboration, in a sense, on lower priority issues or less contentious issues like the environment, has provided an avenue for militaries to talk and try to gain trust and understanding of each other. Again, it has an up and down history, but one that certainly provides opportunities. Even one of our most contentious relationships with Iran, this is almost 20 years ago now, but I had the opportunity to participate in what was called the Environment, Peace, and Dialogue of Civilizations Initiative, which was frankly just a way from the Iranian perspective to find ways to talk internationally. And so this was a conference that had not very many Americans, but a significant number of other countries, collaboration with the UN Environment Program, so showing the role that the UN could play as in terms of being a broker, where, yes, there were lots of really interesting environmental issues that we talked about, but really it was the fact that we were talking, and this was an avenue to do it. So in this way, kind of entirely different manifestation than, say, the International Joint Commission between US and Canada, but it's that diversity under the umbrella of environmental peace building that should encourage innovation, whether that is neighborhood to neighborhood or state to state here in the United States or country to country. We've done some work in this space, not just in the water space, with a lot of water examples, but also transboundary conservation. You may hear about peace parks, so that you, again, in these shared ecosystems, you have a logic for collaborating to manage the ecosystem, hopefully in ways that aren't about exploitation, but are about conservation. This is an area that, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, became different countries. Kosovo, Montenegro, Albania was not part of Yugoslavia, but had its own challenges with a long-time, very closed communist regime. And so we've run a study abroad program working with local actors there on all parts or on all three countries in that shared border area, finding ways around sustainability, ecotourism, for sustainable livelihoods that are, yes, trying to address immediate economic needs, but with the formation of new national parks and in what was the battleground, particularly between Kosovo, Montenegro, and Serbia, bringing ex-combatants who were on either side of the conflict, including there in Mount Hyla, where we had a group of folks from Ohio University going to both study and then provide research to support that ongoing process. So that conservation space, again, it's in some instances is being quite a productive frame, and others it's seen as just even making the job harder, right? Transboundary conservation is hard enough. And so don't load it up with additional expectations of building peace. Some of it is about how we frame it. And so often, whether it's environment security, climate security, environmental peace building, sometimes not naming that as an objective of the work, but understanding that the collaborations across borders can contribute to some of these peace building dimensions is the approach that can kind of be balanced, so to speak. So to try to sum up a lot of diversity and a lot of prospects for exploration of this approach, that interdependence doesn't necessarily beget conflict, that the need to work together over time around a shared resources can be proactively designed to try to build trust between parties. It really is one that kind of can operate along that continuum from prevention and to mitigate and to get out of conflict and then to rebuild and move forward after conflict. Seeing examples where folks are using some of these principles in with renewable natural resources, non-renewable natural resources, ecosystems in a broader sense, where there are environmental services that are and ecosystem services that are critical, but don't have a kind of single sector water, forests, fisheries dimension to it. Absolutely different levels. And sometimes that is very local work adding up to and contributing to international. Sometimes it's just local and stays within a country and within a state and within a neighborhood, and lots in between. Historically, the focus was initially on higher levels of conflict, so violence. But I think increasingly, kind of like the environment security field and the climate security field, that it was seen as a necessary but wholly insufficient area of focus, and it needed to be a much more inclusive dialogue for utilizing these principles and to not exclude the possibility that um, a range of ways that there are conflictual or even just uncertain or tense relationships can have benefit by looking to the environment and the climate space as an avenue for not just tackling those environment or climate problems, but looking to have kind of multiple bottom line co-benefits, triple bottom line, the kind of metaphor of getting multiple wins from a common approach. But one needs to kind of be purposeful about that to be able to enumerate it, whether that's explicit in how it's framed or a step back in terms of some of the underlying goals that don't necessarily need to be made as explicit, but nevertheless can be present. And so in this regard, I think my bottom line message is this is a tool in the toolbox. It's an approach that doesn't succumb to the inevitability of conflict around shared, declining, dwindling resources, contested resources. And sometimes it's hard to imagine that this, particularly in times of conflict, will be an avenue forward. But I leave you with this picture of Colonel Pinheiro from Angola and Colonel Turton from South Africa, both former military officers in this photo, but both who went on to be water management professionals from South Africa and Angola, which during the apartheid era were absolutely at war in the Okavango Delta, and now are in part because they've seen how important water is to their countries and their communities, have devoted themselves to finding ways to cooperate across this former line of conflict on the common battlefield to practice environmental peace building in the conservation space, the water sharing space, and building and rebuilding links between the peoples in those kind of shared ecosystems. And so in that way, it is the kind of approach that gives one optimism. There are plenty of times one could be accused of naivete and not being able to solve all the problems with this approach. But I think if we give ourselves permission to take bite-sized pieces, tailor it to specific instances, and play the long game of establishing collaboration to partner and build trust around important environment and climate issues, it can also be the foundation for building trust and hopefully peace in sectors and dimensions of a relationship that aren't strictly environmental.